Alex Eala's Cincinnati campaign may have ended in heartbreak against Amanda Anisimova, but one of the most interesting stories surrounding her run began several days earlier, when Elena Ruse was forced to retire from their second-round match. Ruse had been struggling physically, Eala had taken complete control, and a lightning delay added another layer of drama. What happened next created a story about competition, injury, respect, and how far Eala has come. Welcome back to the channel, where we break down the biggest developments in tennis with the context behind the headlines. And if you want more coverage of Alex Eala, the North American hardcourt swing, and the road toward the US Open, make sure you're subscribed. Because the Cincinnati story is about much more than one retirement or one difficult loss. Eala entered the match against Ruse with something to prove. Their previous meeting had ended in disappointment for the Filipina, who suffered a painful defeat against the Romanian in the final qualifying round of the 2024 US Open. That result had denied Eala a place in the main draw, and it became another difficult lesson during the early stages of her professional career. This time, the circumstances were completely different. From the opening stages in Cincinnati, Eala looked like the player determined to control every part of the match. After dropping her serve in the opening game, she immediately responded with relentless pressure. She won 6 consecutive games to take the first set 6-1, and the numbers reflected the difference between the two players. Eala was aggressive on returns, confident from the baseline, and consistently forcing Ruse into uncomfortable positions. The second set followed the same pattern. Eala continued to attack while Ruse struggled to find a way into the contest. The Filipina quickly built a 3-0 advantage, putting herself within touching distance of another significant victory. Then the match took an unexpected turn. Ruse called for a medical timeout, with attention focused on her right foot, which had clearly been causing problems during the contest. The medical timeout changed the atmosphere around the court. Until that point, the story had been almost entirely about Eala's dominance. Suddenly, the result was no longer simply about whether the Filipina could complete another convincing win. The question became whether Ruse would physically be able to continue. Her movement had already appeared compromised, and the treatment on her foot made the situation impossible to ignore. Then came another complication. Lightning and approaching severe weather forced play to be suspended at the Lindner Family Tennis Center. The interruption arrived at an especially important moment because Eala was firmly in control, while Ruse had just received medical attention. The weather delay gave both players time away from the court, but it also gave Ruse a chance to assess whether continuing was realistically possible. When the players were cleared to return, the match did not resume for long. Ruse informed officials that she could no longer continue, bringing the contest to an abrupt end. Eala advanced, but there was an obvious difference between winning a completed match and advancing because an opponent was unable to finish. For Eala, it was still an important victory, but there was no reason to celebrate another player's physical problem. And that distinction mattered. Eala had dominated the match before the retirement, but she also understood that an opponent's health comes first. Instead of turning the moment into a personal celebration, she immediately expressed concern for Ruse and wished her a speedy recovery. That response became one of the most important parts of the story because it showed how Eala handled a complicated victory. Eala later explained that she felt she was playing well and had remained focused throughout the contest. Her performance suggested a player who had learned how to manage pressure and maintain intensity even when the match became unpredictable. But when asked about the retirement, her attention moved away from tennis strategy and toward Ruse's health. Her message was simple: injuries are difficult, and the opponent's recovery is the priority. That reaction carried additional weight because of the history between the two players. Ruse had previously beaten Eala in a crucial US Open qualifying match, creating a painful memory for the Filipina. Years later, Eala found herself in a position of complete control against the same opponent. Yet when Ruse could not continue, Eala did not use the moment to gloat about revenge. Instead, she showed the kind of restraint that can be difficult in professional sport. 4. Eala Cincinnati was also part of a much larger progression. She had already built significant momentum during the North American hardcourt swing, and her results had begun to change the expectations surrounding her. The player who once had to fight through Grand Slam qualifying was now arriving at major WTA events with opponents increasingly aware of what she could do from the baseline. That is why the Ruse match mattered beyond the final score. Eala demonstrated that she could impose her game against a player with strong WTA experience and previous deep runs at major events. She did not simply wait for Ruse to make mistakes. She created pressure, attacked the return, and kept the Romanian from settling into a rhythm. The retirement ended the match, but the performance before it had already made its point. There was also an important emotional element. Eala had experienced the frustration of injuries and physical problems herself during the season. She knew how quickly a match can change when the body stops cooperating. That perspective helps explain why her reaction to Ruse was so measured. A professional tennis match can be fiercely competitive, but the person across the net remains an athlete dealing with the same physical demands. Ruse's own history also provides context for why the situation attracted attention. The Romanian had previously spoken publicly about the abuse she received online following difficult tournament results. That experience highlighted another side of professional tennis that is often overlooked. Players are expected to perform under intense pressure, and when results go badly, social media can make that pressure even heavier. That makes the respectful tone surrounding the Cincinnati retirement particularly significant. There was no need to turn Ruse's injury into a controversy. Without verified evidence, questions about whether an opponent is genuinely injured should not become accusations. The visible treatment and Ruse's decision to stop were enough to establish the basic facts. Anything beyond that becomes speculation, and the story is stronger when the line between reporting and assumption remains clear. The real competitive takeaway was Eala's level. She was winning games consistently, controlling exchanges, and putting Ruse under pressure in almost every phase of the match. The statistics cited from the contest showed just how one-sided the performance had become, particularly on return. Eala was not merely benefiting from an opponent's physical problem, she had already established a commanding position before the retirement occurred. Then Cincinnati delivered another test. Eala moved forward, but the tournament eventually brought her face-to-face with Amanda Anisimova. Suddenly, the conversation changed. The question was no longer whether Eala could defeat Ruse. It was whether the Filipina could continue her momentum against a player capable of testing her in longer, higher-pressure exchanges. Anisimova ultimately ended Eala's Cincinnati run, turning what had been an impressive stretch into a more complicated story. Eala had shown that she belonged in the conversation, but she also experienced the difficult reality of professional tennis. One great performance does not guarantee another. The loss was disappointing, particularly after the momentum she had created, but it did not erase what came before it. And this is where Ruse's role in the story becomes interesting. The Romanians' match with Eala was already an emotional chapter because of their previous history. Then Eala continued her tournament journey before eventually falling to Anisimova. The broader narrative became less about revenge and more about recognition. Eala had demonstrated a level that demanded attention, while Ruse had been forced to confront both the physical demands of competition and the reality of facing a rapidly improving opponent. For Eala, the biggest lesson may be that progress is not measured only by victories. Her Cincinnati experience contained almost everything a young professional needs to learn: dominance, an opponent's injury, an unexpected weather interruption, the pressure of advancing, and finally the disappointment of losing a match she wanted to win. Each situation requires a different response, and how a player handles those moments often becomes just as important as the tennis itself. The emotional maturity Eala showed after the retirement is particularly worth noting. She could have focused entirely on the fact that she had avenged a previous defeat. Instead, she focused on Ruse's recovery. That does not make the competitive result less important. It simply shows that winning and respecting an opponent do not have to be opposites. In a sport built around individual competition, that balance can reveal a great deal about a player. The Cincinnati run also continued to build anticipation around Eala's next major challenge, the US Open. She was no longer approaching the Grand Slam as an unknown qualifier. She had gained experience against established opponents, played under bigger expectations, and learned how quickly momentum can change. The attention surrounding her had grown, but so had her experience in dealing with that attention. That is perhaps the most important difference between the Eala who lost to Ruse in 2024 and the player who faced her in Cincinnati. The earlier defeat was a setback for a teenager still trying to establish herself. The later meeting came with Eala carrying much greater confidence and expectations. She did not need to prove that she belonged on a WTA court anymore. Her task was to show that she could consistently perform at that level. The retirement itself will always mean the match did not reach a traditional conclusion. Eala could not finish the contest with a final point, and Ruse did not get the opportunity to fight back after her medical timeout. That is simply part of the reality of tennis. Players cannot control every circumstance surrounding a match. What they can control is how they perform while the match is active and how they behave when circumstances change. And Eala's behavior was one of the clearest positives to come out of the situation. She played with aggression, maintained her concentration, and then showed concern when her opponent could not continue. That combination is important because professional success requires more than hitting the ball well. It requires emotional control, adaptability, and the ability to move forward after unexpected developments. For Ruse, the episode was a reminder of how unforgiving the professional schedule can be. The body has to withstand constant travel, hard courts, repeated matches, and the pressure to perform. A player can enter a tournament with a clear plan and still have that plan disappear because of an injury. The appropriate response is recovery, not speculation, and the tennis community should leave the medical assessment to the professionals. For Eala, meanwhile, the story moves forward. The loss to Anisimova does not cancel the progress she made in Cincinnati. If anything, it provides another reference point. She now knows what it feels like to enter a major tournament with growing expectations and to face increasingly difficult opponents. The next step is learning how to convert that experience into consistency across an entire tournament. There is also a larger significance to Eala's rise. Filipino fans have followed her journey with enormous enthusiasm, and her performances have given tennis supporters in the Philippines another reason to pay attention to the sport. The atmosphere surrounding her matches reflects more than individual popularity. It shows how one athlete can create a new connection between a country and a global sport. That support can be a source of energy, but it can also create pressure. As Eala's profile rises, every loss will receive more attention, every victory will produce bigger expectations, and every opponent will arrive knowing exactly who they are facing. Managing that environment will be part of her development. Cincinnati offered another lesson in that process, both on the court and away from it. The bigger question now is not whether Eala can produce one spectacular performance. She has already shown that she can. The challenge is repetition. Can she continue competing at this level against different styles, different surfaces, and different forms of pressure? Can